Max Verstappen's F1 title hopes might be hanging by a thread, but he did something extraordinary in the Brazilian Grand Prix to stop them being obliterated entirely. Verstappen finished on the podium after starting from the pit lane in Interlagos and even led the race before making his final pit stop, a call that some people think denied Verstappen the chance to pull off a shock victory. Pit lane to podium races are incredibly rare in F1, and this was the first time a driver's managed it since Lewis Hamilton in the wet 2014 Hungarian Grand Prix. Verstappen's also only the 4th driver this century to pull it off. It looks all the more remarkable when you think Verstappen also needed an early pit stop after picking up a slow puncture too. But as we'll explain, that misfortune and the disaster that was his Saturday qualifying were actually integral to Verstappen's podium run. Until Sunday, Red Bull's weekend could hardly have been going worse, and its post-summer break revival looked to be emphatically over. Red Bull had already been warned in Mexico that there were certain conditions that could trip it up, although it's hard to read too much into the unique demands of that high-altitude race. Brazil then smacked Red Bull in the face with a massive setback, which had the team completely puzzled. In the simplest sense, it seems to come down to the car still having a very narrow setup sweet spot that's even harder to find when a little more rear ride height is needed. Verstappen had complained about the ride quality of his Red Bull on Friday, which he had to live with in a difficult sprint race on Saturday morning when he finished 4th. Then Red Bull made things even worse. It gambled on changing its car significantly before qualifying, having used the data from Yuki Tsunoda's setup experiment starting the sprint from the pit lane to help, and this backfired spectacularly. Verstappen said the ride issue was replaced by too much sliding, and both Red Bull drivers were eliminated in Q1. It was the first time in Verstappen's career that he's been knocked out in the first part of qualifying purely on a lack of pace. 2 different flaws were tried during the weekend, and Verstappen said with the extent of the changes made, normally you would feel some kind of reaction, but it doesn't, so something is just really off. It suggested some drastic mechanical changes like trying to run the car softer to improve the ride, and increasing the rear ride height came at too great a performance loss. The car was a bit more comfortable, but it had less grip and suffered from all-round sliding. The prevailing opinion is that the Red Bull is too vulnerable to rear ride height changes than other cars. Its aero map has been conceived around running quite low, and the new front wing and floor evolutions that have come since the summer break have tapped into that really effectively, when the car can run low enough. So a bumpy, undulating Interlagos was never likely to suit Red Bull's car the best. Still, Red Bull's risks clearly made the situation worse. But it was so bad, it actually gave the team a second chance to address the problem for the race. Red Bull's drastic action on Saturday was not the first time it's talked about taking risks in weekend under Laurent Mekies' leadership. Mekies has been credited with changing the way Red Bull has approached running its weekends and the setup of its car since taking over the team from Christian Horner in mid-July. This has largely been for the better in terms of finding a better starting point with the car, but that wasn't the case in Brazil. The logic itself was fairly sound. Red Bull looked like it was around or behind Mercedes and Ferrari, so somewhere in the middle of the fight from 3rd to 7th. That would not be good enough for Verstappen's faint title hopes, so it went all in trying to vault to the head of that queue and get closer to McLaren, but that obviously failed. Hindsight is a great thing, but had Red Bull just worked more sensibly with what it had, surely Verstappen would have been in the top 5 in qualifying, with a top 3 entirely possible given Ferrari was not happy at all in Brazil and Oscar Piastri and George Russell underachieved. There was a lot more there for the taking, regardless of the limited potential of Red Bull's car, but by getting it so wrong on Saturday, Red Bull basically had a free hit on Sunday. Pulling Verstappen off the grid and making him start from the pit lane meant Red Bull could change whatever it wanted on the car outside of parc fermé conditions. The older pre-Mexico floor actually stayed on, but the most recent tweak to that was a small evolution, so this wasn't so surprising. Red Bull won't elaborate on the details, but whatever it changed, and with cooler track conditions on Sunday helping too, the car came alive in Verstappen's hands. It was reminiscent of Mexico, where he'd badly struggled for one lap pace, but found the car much more competitive in race trim. Race winner Lando Norris reckoned that Verstappen probably would have won if he'd started higher up, but that's a very simplistic take. It's too easy to say that had Red Bull just kept the car changes to a minimum in the first place and started from the top 5 on the grid, it could have used its far better race pace to challenge the McLarens in a straight fight. Now, that wasn't quite what Norris was saying, but we understand why many people might think that way. But without the botched setup gamble and the pit lane start, Red Bull wouldn't have been able to make the right setup tweaks, as what Verstappen had on Sunday was clearly the best version of the Red Bull all weekend. Plus, the pit lane start also allowed Red Bull to give Verstappen a full suite of fresh engine components. Usually, taking any new engine component beyond the season allocation means a 10-place grid drop, and if Verstappen took a whole new engine like he did in Brazil in normal circumstances, he'd have had to start last. Obviously, he was starting so far back that this would have been an option for Red Bull anyway. The pit lane start just confirmed it. So Verstappen added a full set of fresh engine components to his usable pool for the rest of the year and took immediate benefit as well. The Honda engine has always been particularly strong at higher altitude races like Mexico and Brazil, and has good consistent performance across its full life cycle. But a fully fresh engine still buys a little bit of extra performance and doesn't need as much management, so as Verstappen cut through the midfield, the new engine would have been a nice sharp weapon to have. A critical factor in Verstappen's race was suffering an early puncture that prompted a pit stop for mediums after just 7 laps on the hards. Picking the hards to start with was really just a case of trying to do something different, and Verstappen's original plan was to run as long as possible, then attack on softer compounds and or with a tyre offset later on. But the hard was not a good tyre, and that's putting it kindly. 5 cars started on hards, the 2 Red Bulls, Esteban Ocon, who also started from the pit lane, and the 2 Aston Martins. Nobody used it after that, which shows just how bad the signs were from Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, who were the only 2 that ran the hard stint to completion. Verstappen's enforced tyre change seemed to be caused by running over debris caused by the Turn 1 crash between Piastri, Kimi Antonelli and Charles Leclerc, but the cost of it was mitigated by the virtual safety car that incident also triggered. This meant Verstappen had completed his mandatory compound switch without losing as much race time as normal. Starting the 9th lap of the race, he was 16th, 15 seconds off the race lead, on a fresher set of the same medium compound tyres as the leader. You still wouldn't think a podium was likely from that position, and it proved to be a tricky stint. Verstappen said he had to push the tyre quite hard following so many other cars, which made the end of the stint quite tough. But after he sighed through the midfield and ran a net 5th on merit, he was only 20 seconds behind Norris at the point the race leader stopped, so had lost just 5 seconds, making his way up from the bottom of the order. More importantly, the early laps on the hard meant Verstappen could switch to mediums again for his 3rd stint, as he didn't need to worry about using a different compound. So while Norris managed the softs, Verstappen carved 10 seconds out of the margin to the leader, and a combination of his progress on mediums, plus pitting just before Piastri and benefiting from fresher tyres, meant Verstappen jumped the other McLaren as Piastri served his 10-second penalty for that Turn 1 collision. This brought Verstappen properly into podium contention, and on the hunt behind the 2 Mercedes that needed to stop earlier than him. When they did, and Norris dumped his softs for mediums for his final stint too, Verstappen was released into the lead. There was enough time for some light relief as race engineer Gianpiero Lambiase expressed his own surprise at the position, but it also brought a dilemma. Ever wondered what amazing content you're missing inside the Race Members Club? Well, now's the time to check it out for an entire week, completely free. Simply click on the link below to get all the bonus content, ad-free videos and podcasts we publish from the 5th to the 12th of November, absolutely free. No sign-ups or forms to fill in, just go and enjoy all our new content for free. With 20 laps to go and mediums that were only 15 laps old, it was possible for Verstappen to go to the end. Possible, but risky. Especially as tyre degradation had been aggressive, with quite a performance cliff at the end of every stint. Verstappen had suffered that himself, even if getting through slower cars had played a part in it, and the fuel load was higher too. Mercedes reckoned if Verstappen stayed out, he would have won the race. There were certainly other success stories in nursing the mediums a mighty distance, none more so than Liam Lawson, one stopping his way to 7th with a 52-lap stint on mediums. But Red Bull and even McLaren felt this would have been too big a roll of the dice given how much the tyres were dropping off and the gap that Verstappen had. After all, Norris was ultimately just 7 seconds back after his stop and would only have a bigger tyre advantage as the stint went on. Holding on in a desperate attempt to win would have been a Hail Mary too far, and potentially dropped Verstappen behind both Mercedes drivers and Piastri again. Instead, Red Bull opted to attack for the podium rather than try to defend it, hence the final stint on softs. That wasn't meant to be quite as swashbuckling as Verstappen made it. He got warned by Lambiase that the soft had been vulnerable, but Max opted to go all in and deal with the consequences. Red Bull timed the pit stop perfectly to get out ahead of Piastri without giving him a massive tyre offset, so that was one job done, and as it happened, the soft held up very well. Verstappen caught and passed George Russell and closed right up onto Antonelli before the finish, but that caused the tyres to overheat just a little bit too much and prevented a move for second that would have matched the best result from starting in the pit lane in F1 history. From the Dutch Grand Prix at the end of August to now, Verstappen has failed to finish off the podium. That's 7 races in a row with 3 poles and 3 wins in that time. It's remarkable that Verstappen's podium run continued in Brazil just when it looked like the team's revival and his late title charge would come to a shuddering halt. But as great as his Sunday drive and result are, in reality this weekend was still a big blow and potentially a fatal one to Verstappen's championship hopes. His Saturday was so bad that in the middle of the weekend, Verstappen had already bluntly and glumly said you can forget about him winning the championship. Verstappen's efforts on Sunday did limit the damage, and he is surely closer to Norris than he could possibly have expected when he trundled down the pit lane before the start of the race. But remember, as good as Sunday was, Verstappen was only 4th in the sprint behind the 2 Mercedes drivers as well as Norris. Meanwhile, Norris swept to 2 poles and 2 wins across the sprint and the main race in Brazil for a maximum haul of 33 points. So Verstappen's still fallen to 49 points behind Norris with just 3 race weekends and 83 points still up for grabs. And the upshot is simply that it's going to take the championship equivalent of his shock Brazil turnaround to deny Norris this title.